crimson shadows the battle against Count Dracula. The musty scent of ancient parchment filled my nostrils as I, Jonathan Harker, penned these words by candlelight. The castle's stone walls seemed to close in around me, an oppressive reminder of my captivity. How naive I had been, how utterly unprepared for the horror that awaited me in the remote Carpathian mountains of Transylvania. It had all begun innocently enough. As a newly qualified solicitor, I was thrilled to be entrusted with an important real estate transaction for a mysterious foreign nobleman, Count Dracula. The journey from London had been long and increasingly unsettling. The closer I got to Castle Dracula, the more anxious and superstitious the locals became. They crossed themselves at the mention of the Count's name and pressed crucifixes and garlic into my hands. I dismissed their fears as mere superstition, the remnants of medieval folklore clinging to this remote corner of Europe. How wrong I was. The castle loomed before me, a jagged silhouette against the twilight sky. As my carriage approached, I could have sworn I saw a tall, gaunt figure watching from one of the upper windows. But in the blink of an eye, it was gone. Count Dracula greeted me at the door, his appearance both aristocratic and unsettling. He was tall and thin, with a long, white mustache and pallid skin that seemed never to have known sunlight. But it was his eyes that truly unnerved me, red-rimmed and intense. They seemed to bore into my very soul. "Welcome to my home," he said, his accent thick but his English impeccable. "Enter freely and of your own will." Little did I know the significance those words would hold. The first few days passed in a blur of business, transactions, and unsettling encounters. The Count was only available at night, claiming a multitude of daytime responsibilities. Our meetings were productive, but I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The castle was vast and eerily empty, save for the Count and myself. No servants, no other guests, not even the sound of birds or insects from outside. It was on the third night that I first saw them. Unable to sleep, I had wandered the castle's corridors, eventually finding myself on a balcony overlooking the courtyard. There, in the silvery moonlight, I saw three women, if women they could be called. They were inhumanly beautiful, with lustrous hair and full lips, but their eyes glowed with an unholy light. They moved with a fluid grace that seemed almost serpentine. Mesmerized, I watched as they approached a large sack that writhed and whimpered. To my horror, I realized it contained a child. The women fell upon the sack with animalistic ferocity, their cruel laughter mingling with the child's muffled screams. I must have made a sound, for suddenly their eyes were upon me. They floated up towards the balcony, their faces a mixture of hunger and seduction. I was rooted to the spot, unable to flee as they drew nearer. Just as I felt their cold breath on my skin, a commanding voice rang out. "How dare you touch him? He belongs to me." It was the Count, his face contorted with fury. The women cowered and retreated, leaving me alone with Dracula. His eyes met mine, and in that moment, I knew with chilling certainty that I was in the presence of something inhuman. "Return to your room, Mr. Harker," he said, his voice calm once more. "It is not safe to wander at night." From that moment on, I knew I was a prisoner. The doors were locked, the windows barred. I searched desperately for a means of escape, all while trying to maintain the facade of a willing guest. The Count's behavior became increasingly erratic and threatening. I often awoke to find him looming over my bed, his eyes gleaming with unholy hunger. It was during one of my explorations that I made a terrifying discovery. Hidden in a disused chapel, I found 50 boxes of earth, recently arrived from Transylvania. In one, to my utmost horror, lay the Count himself, eyes closed, skin gray, looking for all the world like a corpse, save for the trickle of blood at the corner of his mouth. I knew then that the old legends were true. Count Dracula was a vampire, a Nosferatu, an undead creature that fed on the blood of the living. And he was planning to transport himself to England, to my beloved home. And my dear Mina. The realization gave me the strength to attempt a desperate escape. Using bedsheets and curtains, I managed to climb down the sheer castle walls. The descent was harrowing, the rocks cutting into my hands. But the alternative was too horrifying to contemplate. As I fled into the night, I could hear the howling of wolves, the children of the night, as the Count had called them. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, finally collapsing in exhaustion near a small village. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was the face of a kind old woman, making the sign of the cross as she looked down at me. I awoke weeks later in a Budapest hospital, my body weak but my mind clear. I immediately sent word to Mina, my fiancé, and to my employer, Mr. Hawkins. But even as I began my recovery, I was haunted by the knowledge that Count Dracula was on his way to England. I had to warn them, to stop him before he could spread his evil to my homeland. Little did I know that the horror had already begun to unfold. While I had been trapped in Castle Dracula, a Russian ship called the Demeter had run aground near Whitby, its entire crew missing or dead. The only living thing aboard had been a large dog, which had bounded ashore and disappeared into the night. In London, my dear friend Lucy Westenra had fallen ill with a mysterious ailment. She grew pale and weak, with 2 small puncture marks on her neck that refused to heal, despite the best efforts of her fiancé, Arthur Holmwood, and the brilliant Dr. Van Helsing. Lucy's condition worsened. She died and was buried, but reports soon surfaced of a beautiful woman luring children into the night. It was Van Helsing who first made the connection. A learned man of science, he was also well versed in the lore of the undead. He realized that Lucy had become a vampire, turned by none other than Count Dracula himself. By the time I returned to England, a small group had formed to combat this evil. Besides myself and Van Helsing, there was Arthur Holmwood, now Lord Godalming Quincy Morris, a brave American adventurer, John Seward, who ran a lunatic asylum, and my beloved Mina. Our first task was to lay Lucy to rest truly at rest. The scene in the graveyard that night will haunt me forever. Lucy, once so sweet and gentle, had become a monster. Her eyes blazed with unholy fire as she clutched a child to her breast. It was only through Van Helsing's knowledge and Arthur's love that we were able to destroy her undead form and free her soul. But our battle was far from over. We knew that Dracula was in England, growing stronger with each passing night. We had to find and destroy him before he could create more of his kind. Our search led us to the Count's various properties around London. We found and destroyed the boxes of earth he had shipped from Transylvania, sanctified with holy wafers to serve as his unholy resting places. But Dracula was cunning, always one step ahead of us. It was during this time that tragedy struck once more. Renfield, one of Dr. Seward's patients who seemed to have a psychic connection to Dracula, allowed the Count into the asylum. Before we could stop him, Dracula had attacked Mina, forcing her to drink his blood. The sight of my beloved, her nightgown stained crimson, the Count looming over her, is one that will never leave me. Mina was now tainted, connected to Dracula in a way we didn't fully understand. But in his arrogance, the Count had made a mistake. Through Mina, we were able to track his movements. We learned that he was fleeing back to his castle, racing against time and the coming winter. Our pursuit took us across Europe, a desperate chase against an enemy who could command the very beasts of the field. We traveled by train, by horse, and finally, on foot through the treacherous Carpathian passes. All the while, Mina grew weaker, the vampire's taint spreading through her. It was in the shadow of Castle Dracula that we made our final stand. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. We could see the black carriage racing towards the castle, driven by skinny gypsies loyal to the Count. Quincy and I charged forward on horseback, while Lord Godalming and Dr. Seward fought off the gypsies. Van Helsing stayed with Mina, protecting her from the vampire women who still lurked in the castle. Time seemed to slow as we neared the carriage. I could see the box inside, knew that Dracula lay within, helpless in his daytime slumber. With a mighty effort, Quincy and I toppled the carriage, sending the box crashing to the ground. The gypsies fought like demons to protect their master, but we were fueled by righteousness and desperation. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I used my kukri knife to pry open the box. There lay the Count, his eyes snapping open as the last ray of sunlight faded. But we were ready. Before he could fully awaken, I plunged my knife into his heart, while Quincy's Bowie knife slashed across his throat. The look of shock and fury on Dracula's face quickly faded, replaced by an expression of relief, almost gratitude. As his body crumbled to dust, I felt a great weight lift from my shoulders. It was over. The evil that had plagued us for so long was finally vanquished. Our victory came at a heavy cost. Quincy was mortally wounded in the battle, and Mina still bore the scars of her encounter with Dracula. But as we watched the castle crumble in the distance, I saw the taint fade from Mina's eyes. She was free, we all were. Years have passed since that fateful day, but the memory remains as vivid as ever. Mina and I have built a life together, blessed with a son named Quincy in honor of our fallen friend. But on dark nights, when the wind howls and shadows seem to move of their own accord, I find myself reaching for the crucifix I still wear around my neck. For I know now that there are dark things in this world, ancient evils that lurk at the edges of our civilization. Count Dracula may be gone, but who knows what other horrors might be waiting in the darkness, watching with hungry eyes for the unwary. And so I keep this record, a warning and a guide for future generations. The price of safety is eternal vigilance. For in this world of scientific marvels and rational thought, it is all too easy to forget that some legends are born of truth, and that sometimes the old ways are the best defense against the shadows that hunger for our souls.